Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Jack Hare. I'm the event coordinator for the Willie Street Co-op. We are here on our fourth week of a five-part series, gardening Q&A with our guest Ben Fuda, who's here with us from Let's Grow Stuff on PBS. And today's topic is sustainable practices. Is that a good way to encapsulate it, Ben?
Yeah, ecological gardening is sort of how I'll refer to it. Yep.
All right, ecological gardening. So if you're attending, you can throw a question into our chat. We'll be happy to address that. And otherwise, we're going to start by beginning with your presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Go for it.
Sounds great. All right, I am sharing my screen here, so we're going to get rolling. So yeah, today we're sort of covering this idea of ecological gardening, ecological planting design, and there's a lot to cover today. So we'll probably, there's a few natural breaking points we have built in for questions, but otherwise we're just going to dive right in and get rolling. If this is your first time joining us for this series, just a quick background on myself. Why am I here? Who am I? Who is this person who pretends to know something about plants? And so I've been in public gardens for just over 10 years. Here are a sampling of some of the spaces I've worked, but sort of public gardens across the Midwest. And a lot of these gardens have been sort of ornamental landscapes with a strong sort of ecological and environmental focus. So from the Allen Centennial Garden at UW-Madison all the way through Fernwood and my personal garden and the Lurie Garden in Millennium Park in Chicago. So I've been giving this talk for a few years, and it's been evolving along the way, certainly, but several years ago when I first sort of started presenting this, this was a quote that was very timely in the moment from 2016. And this idea that these two disciplines of ecology and horticulture have started to merge, and that we're sort of in this era of environmental gardening. And this was really exciting to me because, of course, I'm passionate for this. I love this. And this sort of pumped me up and gave me a lot of hope. That said, some of us may be surprised to learn that horticulture and ecology are sort of weren't closely related before. Plants and ecology, we might assume or think that there's a close relationship there, but not necessarily. And, the horticulture sort of practice, traditional horticulture, a lot of things that we do just are a little counterintuitive to sort of how nature functions. And, we've been trained in ways, culturally, that certain things we do and behaviors we make are the right way to go. And really that's not the case. Again, it's not how nature performs. And so as we think about this idea of what environmental gardening or ecological gardening really means, I sort of like to think about it as we're thinking about relationships. We're thinking about relationships between organisms, in this case, certainly plants, but also those creatures which engage with them, ourselves included. So insects, mammals, birds, all of those sort of pieces. And then, of course, the environments they're living in. Plants don't grow in a vacuum. We don't exist in a vacuum. It's so much of what we do are relationship based. And I think, again, a lot of our traditional horticulture and traditional gardening practices, we might have lost sight of these relationships just a bit. So ecological gardening in a nutshell is really about being able to recognize some of these natural processes, embracing them in our garden design and management. And I use the word management here really intentionally because I like to think about this like, any job you've ever had, the boss, you're like, yeah, that was a really good boss. You probably had a relationship with them where there was some give and take and there was conversation where you could say, look, I'm feeling like I need a new project or a new challenge, or I'd really like to take this training, or, I really would, I'm getting sort of burnt out over here. What if I tried something else? And, your boss would listen, you'd have a conversation. There was some back and forth and some give and take, but ultimately it was a conversation. And, that implies it's sort of a holistic process, I think, a little bit more versus what I would call maintenance. A lot of times we refer to landscape maintenance, and I see that, I think words and our choice of words certainly matter here. And maintenance I see as maybe a bit more linear or maybe a bit more direct. So, we sort of do what we're told without that give and take and that back and forth. And when we just maintain a space, we just keep doing the same thing over and over without really asking why. And so I hope, if nothing else, through this presentation, you start to ask why and sort of look at what you're doing and how you're managing your spaces in those ways. And sort of as a primer for this conversation, we're going to start here. Again, this is an image that probably could have come out of pretty much any suburb in America, I would imagine. nice sort of organic bed lines, plants spaced far apart, and the sort of sea of bark mulch in between. And we're going to come back to this image in a bit, but the one thing I really want to talk about here is bark mulch. That's when you look at the sort of ground square footage, if you will, what's covered by plants versus what's mulched, it's predominantly mulch here. And if you take nothing else away from this presentation, I hope you hear this, and that is no plant evolved to grow in bark mulch. Go to any natural ecosystem, a prairie, a meadow, or even a woodland, and you don't see bark mulch, even in a forest where there are trees all around you. Plants are growing through last year's debris. They're growing through the leaves that fell off the trees, the old stems and twigs and things like that. Certainly there are branches and limbs on the ground, trees fall over, they die, they get knocked over in a storm, but they don't magically disintegrate into this perfectly finely ground, mulch. This is essentially a byproduct of our timber industry. And someone very clever along the way at some point said, I know what I can do. I can market this to gardeners as a mulch. And certainly it is functional to some degree, but it ultimately is a foreign thing. Again, in their genetic memory, no plants understand really how to grow and live in a bark mulch setting. They'd much rather prefer to grow in last year's debris. So this is just one example of how our sort of maintenance and traditional horticulture the culture in horticulture, this is how we behaved for so long, I think, without really asking why we do it this way. So with this in mind, it's sort of in that premise in the forefront of our brains, let's dig in. Let's start looking at this and really thinking about it. So the first part we're going to look at is sort of what I like to call practice and methods. And so these are, how we actually are taking care of our spaces, what we do and how we behave when we're interacting with our landscape. And we're coming back to this idea and looking at these images. Not only is bark mulch a factor here, but also I really want to talk about the sociability of plants. And again, looking at these natural ecosystems, plants grow with each other. They occupy different layers. Some are close to the ground, others are taller up, sort of a canopy and an understory layer. Even outside of a woodland, we see this happening. Plants are growing through each other. They're leaning on each other for support. So often in our gardens, when we have to stake something or something's flopping over, chances are that's because they don't have the natural supports they would have in the wild, or, they've been bred so heavily that they have these huge, big, beautiful flowers, but functionally they're top heavy. They don't function in the way that maybe nature, quite frankly, intended. Years ago, as I was giving this talk, a plantsman, Roy Diblick, who I really admire, would use the quote, imagine if I told you that you could never be hugged by another human being ever again. And, the room would chuckle and people would kind of laugh nervously a little bit, but we use that example to talk about the sociability of plants. These are plants in community. These are plants, again, supporting one another and leaning on each other. And here they are without that. And, this sort of last year that we've all lived through, this collective experience of social distancing and quarantines and lockdowns, that's essentially what we're doing to plants. When we plant them in this way, we're spacing them out, we're isolating them from one another. They want to be social. They want to interact with their neighbors. And, again, it won't kill them to do this. Again, we've survived a pandemic, but I think we can all agree it sucked. Like, it wasn't fun. Survival is different than success and really thriving. And so plants, with this in mind, what I hope we can start to think about is using plants as green mulch. So rather than bringing in bark mulch or even leaf mulch, which is a better alternative, how can we cover the ground? By planting more plants. And, what gardener wouldn't love this answer? But we can do this by, finding those plants that fill those niches, whether it's just a little pocket a few inches across or big gaps. This planting has a lot of room for new plants. There's a lot of potential here. But again, a planting like this, there's not a lot of places where light is reaching the soil surface. And of course, you may be asking yourself, well, but one of the reasons we do mulch is to prevent weeds, right? Certainly it's to help the soil retain moisture, maybe to amend it and bring some organic nutrients in. But really, I think most of us primary motivation functionally for mulch, aside from aesthetics, is to prevent weeds. Well, weeds, we've all sort of seen this inspirational poster hanging over the water cooler at some point, of, well, weeds are just plants whose virtues haven't been identified yet, which I think is a really sweet idea, but that's exactly true. Weeds are, we call these plants weeds, but in nature's eyes, these plants are early colonizers and first responders. Weeds, again, the plants we call weeds are those which arrive after a disturbance. So whenever there is exposed soil, they're the first to return. And their job is to stabilize a somehow disturbed system. So think wildfire, landslide, flood, a tornado, all of these natural, or a herd of bison moves through and really just eats everything to the ground and tramples the ground. All of these create disturbance. All of these sort of till up soil a bit. And topsoil is extremely precious. That's where most of the soil life is. That's where most of the action is happening. And it takes years to build up layers of topsoil, years and years and years. And so when soil is disturbed, nature sort of, again, when they call 911, the first responders are weeds. They're the first ones to come in. They grow quickly, they spread quickly, and they're often short-lived. But what they do is stabilize the system so that more diverse and longer-lived plants can return over time. And so if you have weeds in your garden, nature's sending you one very simple, clear signal: plant more plants. That's the bottom line. So when you have plants like in this image here that are all sort of every space is filled, there really isn't any soil showing, your weeds will be almost nil. There might be a little tweaking you have to do, but compared with a big garden space, this becomes so much easier. And again, the plants are in community. They're growing together and through one another, and it's such a rich tapestry to see year round. This is the same garden, just seen from different seasons and different angles. So all of these plants are in here. It just changes, with the seasons. The second thing is to really practice our observation skills. And whether this is just, grabbing your phone and taking some photos while you're walking through your garden, going to others' gardens, going to public gardens and observing, but your plants will tell you something if you're able to pause and pay attention. Traditional horticulture sort of gives us all of these jobs and these tasks to do, which is part of what makes gardening rewarding, certainly, is having that purpose. But at the same time, being able to step back, one of our tasks is to observe. We don't always have to be deadheading or pulling weeds or lifting or dividing, but to just stand back. If we have a plant that suddenly is seeding into a bunch of places and there's a lot of babies popping up, well, that plant is telling you it's extremely happy there. It has great conditions to thrive and grow, and being able to recognize that and say, oh wow, this plant is doing great. That's exciting. But what else does that tell you? Because the next piece of this is this idea of editing. Because when plants are super happy, I think a lot of gardeners are reluctant to remove any, even desirable plants, I'll call them, that might start seeding or spreading around. And I used to be this gardener myself. I would just sort of let everything grow. I grew everything no matter what it was. But that's really, I think over the years I've developed what I call now a killer instinct. As plants reseed and find their ways into places, it really is important to, because, again, if there's one or two things that are super perfectly well adapted to where you're growing, give it 3 years or 5 years with absolutely no editing, and that's all you're going to have are those one or two plants. That is, the sort of that definition of natural selection and competition, is the plants that are best adapted will be the ones that over time thrive. And as gardeners, we're doing some management here. This isn't doing no maintenance. There is a hands-on component of this, but there is, being able to get in and pull stuff back and not being afraid to do some of this editing as well, to keep our systems diverse and balanced. And again, this can be and feel pretty extreme. The photo on the right, this was my old home garden, and all of that material sitting on the turf in front, those aren't weeds. Those are things I planted. I, at one point, desired to have them in the garden, and they came out of the space right behind them. You almost can't tell that I removed things, because that's how thick and sort of overgrown it was. These plants really, really, really needed to come out. It was just too much. And so, again, this process of editing, it may look extreme, it may feel extreme, but I think in the end, it really is worth it to do some of this editing. Also, leaving brown material. So, when we think again about how nature operates, there is no natural mechanism that in the fall comes through and cleans out the garden. There isn't a herbivore, there isn't a weather event, nothing which cuts all of this down to the ground and removes it and takes it to a compost pile somewhere. That is a completely human invented practice that, again, at some point made its way into our gardening culture because we have this sort of obsession with tidying up the landscape or cleaning things. Nature tidies itself by allowing things to decompose in place and feed back into the soil. Nothing comes through and removes this material. The other piece of this is that this is incredibly important wildlife habitat. So seed heads like the coneflowers that we see here, those nice dark small pincushions, things like finches and birds love this in winter. This is a really important food source. But also native insects will lay their eggs in this debris, and this is where they will overwinter and hibernate. And if we come through and clean everything out, we're essentially telling those beneficial, important insects, you're not welcome here. We're taking away their housing, their habitat, and their food. And so if we want to encourage and support diverse wildlife, we need to leave this material over winter. And in reality, when it's safe to cut things back are when we get to the spring. And we want to wait until, the moment the snow is gone is actually not our best time. We want to wait until temperatures average above 50 degrees during the day for at least a week. And the reason we do this is because all of those hibernating, overwintering insects, well, they need time to wake up. And so we don't want to clean up too quickly. But typically late March, maybe early to mid-April, that's about when we want to be doing winter cleanup. But just because we have a warm day in February doesn't mean it's time to break out the rake and the pruners and go to town. Patience is key. But the final piece I'll say about this, from an aesthetic perspective, because if you're looking at this saying, well, but that, aesthetically that feels messy, that doesn't feel great, thinking of it from a design perspective, when you talk to any designer or artist about color, they never say, oh, well, that's purple. I think we need to use more precision when we talk about colors. So for instance, purple is periwinkle, lavender, puce. Look at go to any paint shop or a hardware store and look at all the paint swatches. White has 150 different names and colors and variations. The same is true for brown. Looking just at this image, there's chocolate and sepia and taupe and sand and terracotta and gold and black and there's just so many depths, and there's a huge palette that we've only barely begun to think about because we've never looked at the season, I think, through that lens before. But when we start gardening in a way that embraces this and choosing plants that do this, there's a whole new palette of things that opens up for us. This is, the excitement is not over at this point. It's just slowing down to some degree. And the final piece aesthetically is that also this architecture of plants. We have these sort of bones and armatures that catch the snow and the frost, and they give us something to look at over winter. And it's so much better than just a blank flat slate that, where there's nothing to see. This is at least some visual interest. And of course, it will change depending on, frost is some of those early fall frosts at this point are just gorgeous. And again, the first snowfall, that light dusting is just really magical, on these moments. And then when we do get to spring, again, I mentioned there's no natural mechanism that cuts things back. But here in the Midwest, when we do have heavy, wet snows, that usually will pack a lot of the stuff down to the ground. And that's that natural mechanism coming into play. Again, that's how nature intended, really, to sort of recycle this material. Again, I would argue that these can be beautiful, structural, architectural. There's a lot going on in our gardens for this time of year that I think we can really look forward to in November and December. And the final piece of sort of these practices section are the idea that let's really think about putting the right plant in the right place. A lot of times, again, traditional horticulture has told us, well, the perfect and ideal soil is, sort of moist, or I'm sorry, medium moisture, well drained, a lot of organic material, all your plants will grow and thrive and be huge. But that's not true. It's sort of the equivalent of saying everyone is going to live in the same house, in the same way, in the same neighborhood, and eat the same food every day. And we know that's not how our lives work. Some of us need a 2-bedroom house. Some of us need a 4-bedroom house. Some of us want to live in the country. Some of us live in apartments. Plants are exactly the same way. Rather than trying to change our site, cutting down a tree that really it doesn't need to leave, or again, bringing in dump trucks of compost in order to grow, delphinium or some plant that's a really thirsty sort of needy plant. You can certainly do that. It's not to say those are, you shouldn't grow those things, but just realizing that when we choose our plants based on the space we have, rather than sort of doing it, the other way around, this whole experience of gardening can be so much more rewarding because our plants will be happy. They will perform and look great in the soil that you have and the conditions that they have, regardless of what you do to them. And I think that's a pretty magical, special thing. All right, so now we're moving into part 2 here, and we're going to start talking about plant selection specifically. So, and in this way, this slide usually gets a few raised eyebrows from gardeners. And what I mean by this idea of the rabbit's eye view, and this is a phrase I borrowed from an English gardener and writer, Noel Kingsbury. And what he really was referring to here is this idea that where the plant meets the soil surface, where we go from roots and crown to leaves and flowers above the soil, how that plant behaves at that soil plant transition line will tell us a lot about how a plant will behave in our garden. And so, we're not going to look at lists of plants today. We're not going to talk about, well, this is better or worse than that, or et cetera. But really, if you're looking at a plant in a garden center, this is a very quick and easy way to know how a plant will grow for you once you get it home. Because I think we've all had that experience of buying something that was pretty in a garden center and then suddenly took over our gardens. And we, 2 to 3 years later, we were cursing ourselves for ever planting it. A lot of plants that are classified as invasive by the DNR are still sold in garden centers and nurseries. There's one state, and I can't remember who it was, just outlawed the sale of invasive plants in nurseries, the first state to do so. And it doesn't kick in for, I think, a couple of years. So they're giving the industry time. But I think, don't assume that just because a garden center is selling it means that it is a well-behaved plant that is really a good plant to grow. But by sort of taking this rabbit's eye view, it's an easy, quick way for us to know what we're in for. So we're going to talk grasses quickly and first. And so there's 2 forms of grasses to really think about. And the first are what we call cespitose. And so these are the clump formers. And so this one that we're seeing here, this is Discampsia cespitosa, the tufted hair grass. And if you were to pull up those bottom leaves and sort of look at, again, where the plant meets the ground, you'll see a lot of stems growing really tight and close together, versus something like this panicum, which is our native switchgrass. This is a non-cespitose, so it will spread and it will mingle and form larger, dense mats over time. And if you want another example of a non-cespitose grass, just look to your lawns. Lawns are spreading, they spread by underground roots that move horizontally just under the soil surface. And to be able to identify a non-cespitose plant in a garden center, especially anything that's been in a pot for a bit of time, if you've noticed any roots circling the outside of the pot or things starting to grow up from the edges of the pot or little new shoots and stems, that is your clue that this is a spreading plant. And again, just for an example of what's happening underground with non-cespitose grasses, again, this is that same plant in the pot we just looked at. For an old plant, it sends out these horizontal stems over time, and that's how it sort of spreads itself. This isn't to say that one or other of these are good or bad. It really just depends on where you're growing, what your goals are, and what you're trying to do. But again, it's knowing what you're getting into before you bring this plant home so that you don't end up cursing yourself down the road. Flowering plants, pretty similar. We have the clump formers like the allium on the left, and then we have plants like Monarda, the sort of summer bee balm that a lot of us have in our gardens, which spread. They're in the mint family, and so they spread by underground runners. And you might plant Monarda here one year, and then by next spring suddenly it's popping up 2 feet over, and you're thinking, how did that happen? When did that all happen underground? And I missed that at some point. But that's just their natural behavior. And typically the looser your soil, so if it's more sandy or gravelly, the quicker these plants that spread like that will move. If you have heavier clay soil, that tends to slow them down because it's a little harder for their roots to move through the soil. So again, there are advantages to growing in clay in that way. And so, again, this isn't to say either one of these plants is good or bad. It's just knowing what you're getting yourself into. And so as you're thinking about what types of plants you want to grow in your garden and landscape and an ecological garden, coming from public gardens, I think about collections. Public gardens are essentially living museums. We collect different plants and types of plants to help us tell stories. And so most museums, art museums, history museums, you name it, have what's called a collections plan. And this just helps, it's a tool to help you make decisions. Because again, a lot of gardeners, myself included, have been in that situation where we go to a garden center, looking for one thing and we walk out with 10 things that we didn't plan for. And this sort of compulsive plant acquisition, can be a good thing and a bad thing depending on the day, but a collections plan can help you monitor yourself and check yourself, because oftentimes I bring those plants home, I have homes for half of them, the other half I'll just leave in pots for a while, and eventually they'll either die or I'll find a place for them or I'll give them away, and it's wasted time, it's wasted money. We really shouldn't do that if we can help it. So a few things, you can write your own plan, and it doesn't have to be super complex, but just, again, it's a tool to make decisions. So for instance, you could ask yourself, do you only want to grow native plants? Yes or no? Or is it sort of is that line foggy for you? Myself, I'm not a native purist, but I do tend to lean to prefer native plants when I can. But there are also some non-native plants that are well behaved, that are great for pollinators, that stay where you put them. They're just solid, good garden performers, and they're well adapted to our region without being invasive, and I will grow those. Again, are they adapted to your site? Right plant, right place. If you're trying to grow a hosta in full sandy sun, it will not be happy. It loves that moist shade. So knowing where your plants want to be based on what they need and want. What are your aesthetic goals? Maybe you're trying to create a color theme and you like hot colors, the reds, the oranges, the yellows. Maybe you want something that's high contrast, so you're doing golds and blues. Maybe you want to keep things to a certain height. You don't want to block a view, so nothing over 3 feet tall. These are all things that you can look for when shopping for plants to meet those aesthetic goals. Thinking about the outcomes you want from your garden. Are you growing food intermingled with ornamental plantings? Are you trying to support wildlife and again, native plants and pollinators? That is an outcome that your plants can help you meet. And then finally, know what it is you're already growing. If there's something you inherited from a previous homeowner or a family member that was donated to you and you don't know what it is, take some time, contact your local master gardener extension, your local public garden. There's some smartphone apps out there that can help you identify plants today. All of these are options. Just know what you have, because if there's the number of folks who, a lot of us have some pretty not so great things, growing in our backyards. Again, to that point of a lot of our landscapes are not native plants, or they are even classified as invasive. So knowing what you have so that you can prevent it from spreading outside of your space, and to help you manage it too. So I don't see any questions yet, but feel free again to ask those questions as we're going through. But this is sort of, Jack, do you have any, or have you heard any come in?
Well, we had a few things pop up earlier in the week rather than through the chat at this time, so we can tackle some of those if you want. And I think the first is just that folks had questions about the idea of rain gardens. If the ecological garden is one that necessarily has to contain one, and if not, or if so, would you suggest how to design or construct them?
Sorry, you were breaking up there just a little bit. Can you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Short version is folks were wondering about rain gardens. They are essential constituents for ecological gardening, and if you had any thoughts on designing and constructing them.
Okay, yep. So thoughts on rain garden design. Yeah, so rain gardens are a really great sort of poster child for ecological gardening. They purify rainwater, they promote wildlife habitat, and often we put them in places where it's difficult to mow or turf grass just doesn't work, right? So, again, the right plant, right place certainly applies. Looking for those plants that are well adapted to moments of really have, perhaps standing water, but also can, tolerate some drier periods. And there are a lot of, again, plants from natural habitats that can tolerate that. I would look, speaking also from personal experience, try to work with your site if you can. So if you have an area of your property that naturally holds on to rainwater, if it floods after rain, or you notice, next time there's heavy rain, stand by a window and watch where the rainwater goes. Oftentimes, if it's running off of your driveway, your sidewalk, or your roof, you can either put a pipe onto your downspout, you can dig a little trench to get it to a low spot that's already existing, rather than digging a big hole and making your own, what we call a swale, so those depressed areas. If you can work with something you already have and just sort of tweak your site a little bit, that is a far easier and less backbreaking way to do it than sort of constructing from the ground up. The other suggestion is to opt on to plant more plants again than less, going back to that idea of green mulch. But some of the best intended rain gardens I've seen have plants spaced 2, 3, 4 feet apart with seasoned bark mulch in between. Well, bark mulch doesn't have roots. It doesn't hold any soil in place. And so especially if your funnel and bark mulch floats, so you get a good rain and that rain garden fills up, all your mulch is going to float up and settle down to the middle. You're going to have a foot of bark mulch at the bottom of your rain garden and nothing will grow, and then a bunch of weeds growing on the outside because now that soil is exposed. So fill it as quickly with plants, desirable plants, as you possibly can, are probably my 2 biggest recommendations.
Okay, very cool. And then I guess I had a question also. People seem to always have questions about pests, particularly insects. And I think there's often the answer given to say, like, if you have this problem, attract this solution. So I was wondering, this is probably a little bit more in depth. I should have prepared you for this, but maybe if you have certain kinds of insect pests and you want to solve them with other insects, how do you go about doing that? It's not like you just like call 1-800-ladybug? I mean, what do you do? And what
Well,
are
yeah,
some of the most common pests?
sure. And again, I will say I'm not the world's greatest insect pest expert, but what I do know is it really depends on the pest in a lot of ways. Something, again, if you have aphids, for instance, again, that's probably one of our more common garden pests. Certainly, planting flowering plants to attract critters which will eat them or parasitize them are something we can do, and I'll mention some of those in a moment. But the other piece of it is to also, one of the hardest things I think for us is to be patient, because if there is sort of a boom of aphids in your garden, the predators will find them. I think what we often do is we see them occur, and then on the first day we hit the panic button and we go and we freak out and we bring out the chemicals, or we or whatever we may or may not be doing. And it's to just wait a few days. Again, the predatory insects will arrive. I mean, this is their job, this is their food source, and once they find them, things will begin to improve. But that is the of course, organic gardening method of sometimes we may lose a pepper plant here or there, and that's the way it is if you don't want to be gardening with chemicals. And so, but in terms of attracting some of those benefits, or because you can either wait for those predatory insects to find your, say, aphid population, but those predatory insects don't just eat aphids. I mean, they are pollinators themselves. And so anything in the umbel family, and so these are carrots, and carrot flowers have, if you know Queen Anne's lace, it's sort of that delicate sort of plate-shaped flower. Fennel is another. Fennel is an amazing a plant to attract wasps in particular. So, you may be planting these, and, again, they're far less interested in you than they ever will be, again, in the flowers and in the insects. And so you may see these big insects buzzing around your garden, but again, they're not going to bother you. And certainly bees and flies might visit these, but typically things in the carrot family tend to seem to attract wasps better. And again, wasps are carnivores. And often they will parasitize things like aphids. And so those types of plants are great things to use. If you're trying to support bees, things in the aster family, the goldenrods, the mints, all of those typically do pretty well for native, bees and native bees in particular. But yeah, trying to do, and the fennel, the other nice thing with fennels is that they also are the larval host plant for swallowtail butterflies. Oh. So, a lot of us will plant milkweeds for monarchs, and or some people even raise monarchs by hand. And they're, of course, those big, fat, sort of white, green and orange striped caterpillars. Swallowtail caterpillars look very similar. And if you're growing even a tiny patch of fennel, you may go out there and notice caterpillars that look very similar. Well, those are swallowtails. And so you may not see the adults, but if you see those infants on there, that's a really, really good thing. But even if they don't make it to full adulthood, it's probably because a bird found them. And caterpillars are the #1 protein source for birds in raising their young and the fledglings. So, don't freak out if you have caterpillars one day and then not another day. It probably means that a baby bird somewhere had dinner. So, but this is the beauty of ecological gardening and all the pieces. And so fennel can invite wasps, and that helps you control aphids. But it also can invite swallowtails, which if you catch the adults, they're gorgeous, and the caterpillars are great for birds. And of course, fennel's edible, so you can enjoy it. I mean, it's a very multi-layered plant, in that way.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that that attracts swallowtail because I love fennel. So, what a cool thing to pair off with. I wonder
Yes,
what. Have you ever seen those red spotted purple butterflies?
I haven't. No.
They're crazy. It's very psychedelic, like this weird red with up against a vibrant purple. It's just like
Nice.
straight out of psychedelic 60s, but a really, really cool.
Cool.
Like, yes. So I guess like along that line, I wanted to show you. Last week we talked about the pollinator homes, and just by coincidence, I got this week, so folks can see. These were made available in my neighborhood, and this is something Ben talked about last week, which is and sort of where you're at right now in terms of providing homes for what can help your garden. So I'm going to stick that in my yard and see what comes of it. So
Excellent.
yeah, it's just a log.
Perfect. Yeah, excellent. And I'll
Cool.
also say we have an upcoming episode of Let's Grow Stuff that will be featuring those as well. So if you want to make your own at home, and probably won't come out for another few weeks, but if you stay tuned to the PBS Wisconsin Facebook page, that'll be coming out as well.
Awesome. Well, we'll put links to your PBS series on everything that we're putting out related to this broadcast. And yeah, I don't think that we have more questions for you today, Ben, but thank you for joining us.
Well,
And
I still have one more section for the talk.
oh,
So,
sorry.
I have a few more little things to cover, just from sort of for design and aesthetics. And then if there's any
Yeah,
final
let's hear it.
questions, I can take them. Otherwise, we'll turn people loose to go garden. It's a beautiful day here, at least.
It is. It's very nice here too. All right, I'll mute myself and turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. So again, we're going to cover a few again, design tips and tricks. And so a lot of these, if you're familiar with, artistic principles or design principles, will sound very familiar. I often, like to talk about gardening as the slowest of the performing arts, because ultimately all of this is choreographed. And as gardeners, we are the choreographers. We're the set designers. We're the, the plants are the performers. They're the actors in this. But any great performance, there's moments of drama and tension and relaxation and, celebration and joy and sadness. And that all comes through in a garden. Of course, it's prolonged and extended over a season or years or decades. A tree we plant today, we may never see at its full maturity, but future generations will. And so this is, that is sort of the beauty of gardening as an artistic expression, but it also can be political, as we're doing plantings like this that are ecological and we're removing lawns or changing how we're doing things. All of these make statements. And that's, again, a really kind of exciting and fun thing. And so the first tool that we can add to our toolbox is this idea of creating patterns and repetition. And so this, a border is a really great place to look at this, but really this applies to any garden. So, thinking about, this is that we've seen this garden a few times in this presentation. This is at the Allen Centennial Garden at UW-Madison. So if you want to check this out and see it in real time, if you're in that area, go visit. But ultimately, you can see that white mint is blooming maybe every 6 feet or so, and it just sort of goes up and down the border. The allium, which is that purplish pink, again, every 6 feet or so, it comes back. The pennisetum, which is the grass, the fuzzy grass that you're seeing every 6 feet. And so we've created these very simple patterns, and they've repeated down this 70-foot long border. And what this does is it unites everything, and it sort of leads your eye through from one point to another. Because if every 6 feet we totally changed what we were growing, or this was a garden of 300 different species and one of each and everything, our eye wouldn't know where to go. We wouldn't know, there'd just be so much to look at. And certainly for growing and, for our own gardens, a lot of us are collector gardeners. We want one of this and one of that. And that is, again, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're trying to garden, again, a health strip, maybe out front of between the sidewalk and the street, or again, if you're just trying to get rid of your front lawn and you really don't necessarily you just want it to work. You just want it to look good and to work and not necessarily be complicated. Simplification is good. Pattern and this repetition is good to sort of keep things united together, because this also demonstrates intent. Nature isn't going to plant something every 6 feet like clockwork. That's a human intervention. And so a lot of these design tools are intended to convey intent, because often native plantings, or what we sort of traditionally think about as wild or ecological plantings, especially in urban settings like this, have the bad rap of feeling messy, sort of unkept or flopping over or too tall. And the nice thing about pattern is that sort of, again, it just shows that no, this isn't something that we just, to the casual observer who doesn't know anything about what we're trying to do. Again, we're trying to convey that, yes, this was meant to be. This isn't just something we gave up on and walked away from. Again, this is a garden from the Art Institute of Chicago. Again, a really great example of the use of pattern and sort of these clumps of allium, again, every 6 or 8 feet or so, leading your eye down this long garden to land on this focal point of this red sculptural piece. And so, the great thing about repetition as well is that it can lead your eye somewhere. So if you have, again, a piece of outdoor art or sculpture or a cool plant that you really want to highlight, using simple plantings that, again, repeat in this way can lead you to something really special at the end of that road. And the other point I want to make with really both of these gardens, but really just gardening in general, is that especially if you're new to this, you may look at this and say, oh, that looks just too complicated and too much. But again, there's only maybe 12 or 15 plants in this entire border. Again, there's only 2 or 3 things on the stage at a time. Again, thinking about choreography and performance, everything's not blooming at once, but there's, here the allium and the grass and the mint, the white mint. Those are what's on the stage here in, July and August. Those big sort of shrubby things you see in the back of the border, those are the asters. Those will be the final crescendo of the season. Before this, we had salvias and geums and some allium and butterfly weed that were sort of on the stage, but overall very simple. And there's another phrase that Roy Diblick has used that I really enjoy, and it is that ask any New York Times best-selling author, what would have made their book better, or what's one thing they wish they could have changed. And I doubt any one of them would say, if I just had one more letter in the alphabet, that would have made it good or better. And look at the breadth and depth of literature and stories that have been created with 26 letters in our alphabet. And so come to know 20 or 25, 30 plants extremely well. Those are going to be your backbone, your best friends, the ones that you go to and say, I know exactly what you're going to do. So if you're redesigning a garden space, putting in a new garden, expanding, giving them away to friends, you can confidently say, I know exactly how this is going to grow for you because I know it so deeply and so well. But then that also allows you to experiment a bit more easily, because we aren't, trying to learn 300 different new plants and know the quirks and, intricacies of every one of them. But it makes it easier to try a little bit of this here or a little bit of that there that are new and different, because we know the whole garden isn't going to fail. We know our best friends are going to have our back. And, if 80 or 90% of our garden are those best friends, then, we can feel confident experimenting with some other things. So this next concept is the idea of frames, right? So any artistic work has a frame, and the purpose of that frame is to help to encapsulate the work that we've created, whatever that might be. Frames in a landscape can take a lot of forms. It could be something like this low retaining wall. It could be a lawn space. It could be a fence or a hedge. Again, if you're sort of converting your lawn from, traditional lawn to more of a meadow, even just maintaining one mower width of a strip along from the sidewalk to where the lawn goes wild can be extremely helpful, because, again, this is another one of those sort of like subtle displays of intent where it's, we haven't given up. If someone's taken the time to mow this strip and make it clean and nice and tidy, a lot can be forgiven about what's happening on the inside, because this doesn't, again, look like an abandoned property. Like, oh, someone had to do this. And especially if we have flowers and other things sort of coming up through that, that grassy meadow, that helps even more. And if there's a pattern in there and there's repetition, all of these tools starting to combine together help to convey that, somebody thought about this. It isn't just something that was let go. Another concept is thinking about balance. And this sort of relates to editing that we talked about earlier. And this is, again, really the idea that we want the character of individual plants to be able to be expressed fully. So as an example of this, let's use the butterfly weed. And that's sort of the orange flower at the center of this, right in the front there. And, this particular garden, this is the gravel garden at Chanticleer, which is a garden just outside of Philadelphia. If you're ever in the region, please go. But this plant is extremely well adapted to grow in these conditions. Really lean soil, hot, dry, gravelly. It loves it here. And it will reseed prolifically. And if it was allowed to do so, if people just stepped back and said, we're just going to let nature do its thing, this whole gravel garden would be orange, nothing but orange. That's all that would be here, and maybe a few other things. But again, the dominant, well-adapted plants would just sort of do their thing. But if you allow that to happen, first of all, you only have interest for one, brief moment of the season, for just while this plant is blooming. But the character of these plants, sort of these, again, sort of dinner plate-ish forming, overarching stems, which are part of what gives this plant its character, would be totally lost. It would all be mushed together. The same goes for that grass in the background. This is a Mexican feather reed grass. It's a tender plant for us in Wisconsin, so you'd be planting it as an annual or something that would reseed. But again, it has this beautiful sort of fountain-like vase shape. And if you allowed that to reseed too much or didn't edit, and things were all pumped together, that shape would be lost. It would just be one big mashy, mushy mess. So this idea of balance, I think, can be simplified down to the idea of, the character of each type of plant can be identified. And, this first pattern we looked at speaks to that. If this was all that allium, it would just be a little too much. If it was all the mint, it would just be this white cloud, which might be fun, but we need some contrast and some different elements. And again, we can identify where one plant starts and another stops. And that's really what we're looking for. Again, the Lurie Garden in Chicago, another great use of balance. Here we're seeing balance through color. It's all cool colors for May and June. The Salvia River, which is that big swath that runs through the center there, there's 4 different varieties of salvia, but each of them are a little bit of a different color, blooming a bit later and a bit earlier. But it's meant first there's a pattern and repetition there. So of course it's leading our eye through the garden, and it's uniting all of these different garden spaces. But the sort of the undulation in the pattern, it's meant to feel like the Chicago River, and so it's meant to evoke the feeling of moving water. And if it was all just one big block of the same thing, we wouldn't have that feeling of movement and balance as we do. Or if all the purples were over here and all the light blues were over here, it's sort of, the scales would be unbalanced essentially. So another few examples. And finally, I'm just going to end on this idea of contrast. And what I really, want to convey as well is that contrast can take many forms. It isn't just color. Color, as you're thinking about the tools in your toolbox as a garden designer, color is one of many. Here, certainly there are color differences happening here, but texturally, this is a really rich garden. There's only a couple of things blooming here, but there's the really fine, delicate textures of the reeds. There's actually a stream running through here, which you can't see. But then the penstemon, which are those deep, dark leaves, are, sort of a thick and bolder texture. And again, those two textures against each other, because they're so different, are really standing out. And so if you want to think about it, again, a simple way to think about contrast is, how well can you distinguish one plant from another? Again, if you can't tell where the salvia stops and the penstemon starts, well, maybe your contrast could be beefed up a little. And an easy way to check yourself on this is to take a photo of your garden. And again, it may, look beautiful and feel nice, but then what happens when you take the color away? And through the power of technology now, our smartphone, we can just take a photo, open it in our photo editor, and just desaturate it. Again, remove all of the color. Does it still feel successful? Are you still able to distinguish one plant from another? Does it feel as interesting as this does to you? So, that's sort of and if you notice areas in here where you say, well, that just kind of blurs together or looks uninteresting, then we maybe can add in some new contrast to those areas. So that's what we have for today. I know it was a lot of talking this week and a lot to cover, but hopefully this is, some exciting tools to help you, design and garden ecologically and beautifully going forward.
Boy, some of those gardens are just beautiful. Don't you just covet that salvia river?
I do. Yes. If I had a space large enough to do it at home, it would happen. But unfortunately, I don't.
Beautiful. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate all of the good information and the examples. And we're going to share this recording with many different platforms and see you back here next week for the final portion of our series.
Sounds great. We'll see you all then. Take care. Enjoy the day.
Goodbye.
All right, bye-bye.